Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Erich Fromm, the humanist who believed that love and freedom were the twin pillars of human existence. Together and apart, they circled the same questions from opposite shores, one diving into the mythic depths of the psyche, the other building ladders from the social world toward human flourishing. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of human becoming. One seeing archetypal patterns unfolding from a collective unconscious shared across all humanity, the other discovering how social conditions and existential choices shape our capacity to love and create meaning. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Fromm as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. Our story begins in two different worlds, separated by geography, generation, and the very ground upon which they chose to build their understanding of the human soul. Carl Gustav Jung, born in 1875 in the Swiss countryside, emerged into a world still thick with 19th century assumptions about the mind, the spirit, and the boundaries between reason and mystery. His childhood was marked by the tension between his father's strained Protestant faith and his own vivid inner experiences, dreams that seemed to carry meanings far beyond the personal, visions that suggested the psyche was larger and stranger than the new science of psychology yet understood. By the time Jung reached his maturity as a psychiatrist at the Bergholzli Hospital in Zurich, he had already begun to suspect that beneath the surface of individual consciousness lay something vast and shared, a reservoir of images and patterns that connected each person to all of humanity's past. Erich Fromm entered the world 25 years later, in 1900, born into an Orthodox Jewish family in Frankfurt, Germany. His childhood unfolded in the anxious years before the First World War, a period when European civilization believed itself at the apex of progress while unconsciously preparing for its own self-destruction. Young Erich was immersed in the study of Talmud and prophetic texts, learning to read human behavior through the lens of ethical demands and social justice. Where Jung's early formation was shaped by dreams and the symbolic language of Christian mysticism filtered through personal experience, Fromm's was shaped by the prophetic tradition of Judaism, with its emphasis on right action, social responsibility, and the concrete ways human beings treat one another. The Talmudic method of interpretation, with its attention to how laws and stories apply to actual human relationships, would stay with Fromm throughout his life, even as he moved away from religious orthodoxy. When the First World War shattered European certainty, both men were profoundly affected, though in different ways. Jung, already in his late 30s and established in his career, experienced the war as a confirmation of his emerging theories about the collective unconscious, the eruption of mass violence, the apparent possession of entire nations by archetypal energies of destruction, seemed to Jung evidence that beneath the thin veneer of civilization lay powerful autonomous forces that could seize consciousness. He had begun his own descent into what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense inner visions and near psychotic experiences that he carefully documented and from which he emerged with his theory of individuation, the process by which a person becomes psychologically whole by integrating the contents of the unconscious. For young Fromm, barely 14 when the war began, the catastrophe was experienced differently. He saw friends swept up in nationalist fervor, watched as supposedly civilized people embraced mass killing, and was haunted by a question that would drive his entire intellectual life. What is it in human nature and in society that makes people capable of such destructive irrationality? Unlike Jung, who would answer this question by looking to timeless archetypal patterns, Fromm began to suspect that the answer lay in the specific social and economic structures that shaped human character. A young woman he knew, an artist, committed suicide when the war broke out, unable to bear the collapse of everything she believed about human goodness. This personal tragedy crystallized for Fromm the urgency of understanding why human beings, capable of love and creativity, so often choose hate and destruction. After the war, as Europe struggled to rebuild, both men pursued their separate paths deeper into the mystery of the psyche. Jung, having broken with Freud in 1913, spent the 1920s developing his theory of psychological types, exploring alchemy as a symbolic system parallel to the individuation process, and traveling to study the myths and symbols of non-Western cultures. He went to North Africa, to the Pueblo Indians of New Mexico, later to East Africa and India, seeking evidence that the archetypal patterns he discerned in European patients' dreams were universal. For Jung, the psyche was fundamentally oriented not toward the social world, but toward an inner world of symbolic meaning. The goal of psychological development, as he understood it, was individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who one truly is by integrating the shadow, encountering the anima or animus, and ultimately establishing a relationship with the self, that center and circumference of personality that transcends the ego. Fromm, meanwhile, pursued his studies in sociology and psychology, earning his doctorate in 1922 from the University of Heidelberg with a dissertation on Jewish law and its social function. He underwent psychoanalytic training and became affiliated with the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research, the intellectual home of what would become known as critical theory. The Frankfurt School sought to synthesize Marx's analysis of social structures with Freud's analysis of individual psychology, asking how economic systems shape consciousness and how psychological structures perpetuate social oppression. Fromm became part of this project, contributing studies on the authoritarian character and the psychological roots of fascism. Where Jung looked to myth and symbol, Fromm looked to social conditions. Where Jung asked how the collective unconscious manifests in individuals, Fromm asked how society's economic and political structures shape the possibilities for human development. The paths of these two men would never literally cross, yet their works circled each other like distant planets whose gravitational fields nonetheless interact. Fromm knew Jung's work, read it, and ultimately found it both fascinating and deeply problematic. In Fromm's view, Jung had discovered something important, that human beings need meaning, that we are not mere biological machines, but had mystified this insight by locating it in a metaphysical realm beyond history and society. For Fromm, there was no collective unconscious in Jung's sense, no timeless realm of archetypes. They were instead cultural patterns, transmitted through real historical processes that shape imagination and behavior. Myths were not expressions of eternal truths, but products of specific societies struggling with specific problems. The psyche was not autonomous. It was formed in relationship, in the material conditions of life, in the structure of family and economy. Jung, for his part, had little direct engagement with Fromm's work, though he was aware of the Frankfurt School's project and skeptical of what he saw as its attempt to reduce psychological phenomena to social conditions. Jung believed that such approaches missed the numinous core of human experience, the encounter with symbolic realities that cannot be explained away as social products. In his view, social reform without psychological transformation was superficial. Unless individuals underwent the difficult work of individuation, confronting their own shadows and integrating the contents of the unconscious, they would simply recreate the same patterns of projection and unconsciousness in new social forms. The problem was not primarily in social structures, but in the human psyche's relationship to its own depths. Yet, despite these fundamental differences, both men were responding to the same historical crisis. The mid-20th century, with its world wars, totalitarianism, and existential anxieties, demanded new understandings of why human beings seemed so capable of destroying themselves and others. Both Jung and Fromm rejected simplistic enlightenment, faith in reason and progress. Both understood that something in the human condition makes us vulnerable to mass movements, to submission to authority, to the abdication of individual responsibility. Both believed that healing required not just insight, but transformation, not just understanding, but a fundamental reorientation of the personality. Where they differed was in their diagnosis of the root problem, and therefore in their prescription for cure. The historical context in which both men worked cannot be separated from their ideas. Jung came of age in the late 19th century, when European culture was experiencing both the triumph of scientific materialism and a compensatory surge of interest in mysticism, spirituality, and the occult. The discovery of the unconscious by Freud and others suggested that beneath rational consciousness lay vast territories of irrational forces. Jung's response was to take these forces seriously on their own terms, to treat the images and symbols that emerged from the unconscious not as mere disguises for biological drives, but as meaningful communications from a deeper level of psyche. His work with psychotic patients at Berg-Holzli Hospital convinced him that even apparently meaningless delusions contained symbolic patterns that could be found in ancient myths and religious texts. This led him to the hypothesis that there exists a collective unconscious, shared by all humanity, populated by archetypes, universal patterns of imagery and behavior that shape individual experience. Fromm came of age in a different intellectual climate, shaped by the devastation of the First World War and the subsequent social upheavals of the Weimar Republic. He witnessed firsthand how economic instability and social anxiety could give rise to authoritarian movements. His intellectual formation was shaped by Marx's insight that consciousness is socially determined, by Freud's revelation of unconscious motivation, and by prophetic Judaism's insistence on human freedom and ethical responsibility. Fromm's great synthesis was to show how social structures produce typical character structures, patterns of feeling, thinking, and behaving that either promote or inhibit human flourishing. The authoritarian character, for instance, emerged not from timeless archetypal patterns, but from specific family structures and economic conditions that taught people to submit to power and to crave domination over others. As the 1930s descended into fascism, both men grappled with the problem of evil and irrationality. Jung, in his controversial essays on Wotan and German psychology, tried to understand Nazism as an eruption of archetypal forces, particularly the Germanic god Wotan, who represented storm, fury, and ecstatic possession. Jung saw the Nazi movement as a kind of collective psychosis in which millions of people were seized by an archetype, swept up in a numinous experience that bypassed rational consciousness. This analysis, whatever its insights, was deeply problematic, seeming to naturalize Nazism as an inevitable expression of the German psyche, rather than a specific political movement rooted in historical conditions and sustained by propaganda, economic manipulation, and violence. Fromm, fleeing Germany for the United States in 1934, developed a very different analysis. In his book Escape from Freedom, published in 1941, he argued that fascism arose because people could not bear the anxiety of freedom. Modern society had destroyed traditional bonds of medieval community, leaving individuals isolated, insignificant, and anxious. Rather than embracing the positive freedom to develop their unique potentials, many people chose to escape freedom by submitting to authoritarian leaders who promised security and belonging. This was not an archetypal possession, but a specific response to specific social and psychological conditions. It could be understood, predicted, and potentially prevented through social change and psychological insight. The divergence between Jung and Fromm became even clearer in their understandings of love and relationship. For Jung, love was always complicated by projection. The anima, the feminine aspect of a man's psyche, is initially projected onto actual women, leading to romantic fascination that has more to do with one's inner contents than with the real person. The psychological task is to withdraw these projections, to recognize the anima as an inner figure, and thereby to relate to actual others more realistically. Mature love, in Jung's view, requires individuation, becoming conscious of one's own psychological contents so that relationship is not simply a theater for unconscious projection. Yet Jung's focus was always on the intrapsychic drama. The actual other person remained somewhat secondary to the inner work of integrating the contra-sexual aspects of the psyche. Fromm approached love entirely differently, making it central to his vision of human flourishing. In his most famous book, The Art of Loving, published in 1956, Fromm argued that love is not primarily a feeling, but an activity, a practice, an art that can be learned. He distinguished between immature love, which is narcissistic and possessive, and mature love, which he called productive love. Productive love involves care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge of the other. It requires overcoming narcissism, the infantile demand that the world serve one's needs. It involves giving, not in the sense of sacrifice, but in the sense of sharing one's aliveness, creativity, and joy. For Fromm, the capacity for love depends on one's character structure, which in turn is shaped by social conditions. A society organized around competition, exploitation, and alienation produces people whose capacity for love is stunted. To promote love, one must change both individual character and social structures. Here we see a fundamental divergence. Jung saw psychological work as primarily individual, an inner journey that might eventually lead to better relationships, but whose goal was integration with the self, an archetypal center that transcends personal and social relations. Fromm saw psychological health as inseparable from social conditions and ethical relationships. One cannot be psychologically healthy in a sick society, Fromm believed. True individuation, though Fromm wouldn't use Jung's term, requires changing the social structures that produce alienation and narcissism. In the 1950s, both men were at the height of their influence, addressing audiences far beyond professional psychology. Jung, now in his 70s, published his late masterworks on alchemy, synchronicity, and the nature of the psyche. He had become a cultural figure, interviewed about flying saucers and world events, regarded by many as a sage who had penetrated the mysteries of the soul. His institute in Zurich attracted analysans from around the world seeking the transformative experience of Jungian analysis. His influence extended beyond psychology into comparative religion, literature, and the emerging humanistic psychology movement. Fromm, meanwhile, became a best-selling author and public intellectual, applying his humanistic psychoanalytic framework to contemporary social problems. He critiqued consumer capitalism for producing passive, alienated individuals whose sense of identity came from what they owned rather than what they were. He analyzed the nuclear arms race as a manifestation of collective necrophilia, a love of death and mechanical things over life and organic growth. He advocated for democratic socialism, not as a rigid political program, but as a social arrangement that would promote human freedom and love by eliminating exploitation and domination. Where Jung remained largely apolitical, focusing on individual transformation, Fromm was deeply engaged in political questions, believing that psychology must address the social conditions that shape character. The differences between these two men were not merely intellectual, but temperamental and cultural. Jung was Swiss, rooted in a small, stable, neutral country where tradition remained strong and modernization came gradually. His personality had a mystical, visionary quality. He experienced powerful inner visions, took dreams with utmost seriousness, and believed that the psyche contained autonomous entities, complexes, archetypes that had a kind of objective reality. He collected books on alchemy and Gnosticism, built a stone tower by the lake where he could retreat from modern life, and engaged in active imagination, a practice of consciously dialoguing with figures from the unconscious. His worldview was fundamentally symbolic and mythic. Fromm was German-Jewish, shaped by the catastrophe of European Jewry and the immigrant experience in America. His personality was more rationalistic, prophetic, and ethically urgent. Though he broke with Orthodox Judaism, he retained the prophetic emphasis on justice, on calling out hypocrisy, on insisting that faith means nothing without right action. Where Jung's style was often oracular and paradoxical, comfortable with ambiguity and contradiction, Fromm's was clear and argumentative, seeking to convince through reason and ethical appeal. Jung spoke of the mysterium tremendum, the numinous experience that shatters ordinary consciousness. Fromm spoke of alienation, exploitation, and the conditions necessary for human flourishing. Jung's heroes were alchemists and Gnostics. Fromm's were prophets and humanist philosophers. Yet beneath these differences lay some surprising commonalities. Both men broke with orthodox Freudianism, rejecting biological determinism and the reduction of human motivation to sexuality and aggression. Both insisted that human beings need meaning, not just pleasure or power. Both understood that neurosis often reflects a failure to achieve wholeness or authenticity. Both recognize that modern society, for all its material abundance, produces widespread psychological suffering. Both believed that healing requires more than adjusting individuals to social norms. It requires a deeper transformation. The question they disagreed about was where to locate this transformation. Jung looked inward and backward, seeking connection with archetypal patterns that had always structured human experience. The way forward, for Jung, was through symbolic integration, learning to read the language of dreams and myths, establishing relationship with the figures and energies of the collective unconscious. Transformation came through individuation, a process that unfolded according to its own archetypal pattern, which the ego could facilitate but not control. The goal was wholeness, the integration of conscious and unconscious, the realization of the self. Fromm looked outward and forward, seeking to create social conditions that would allow human potentials to unfold. The way forward, for Fromm, was through love, reason, and productive activity, combined with social arrangements that promoted these capacities rather than stunting them. Transformation came through overcoming narcissism, developing the ability to care for others, and engaging in work that expressed one's creativity rather than alienating one from one's humanity. The goal was not wholeness in Jung's sense, but what Fromm called the productive orientation, a character structure capable of love, creativity, and reason. As we settle deeper into this exploration, let yourself feel the pull of these two different visions. Jung invites you into the darkness, asking you to trust the images that emerge from your dreams, to recognize in your personal struggles the echo of timeless myths, to honor the numinous experiences that shake the foundations of rational consciousness. Fromm invites you into clarity, asking you to examine how your character has been shaped by social forces, to develop your capacity for love and critical reason, to work toward a society that promotes human flourishing rather than exploitation and alienation. One path leads through symbol and myth, the other through ethics and social analysis. Yet both seek healing, both honor the depth and complexity of human existence, and both refuse the shallow optimism that ignores the darkness in the human condition. In the years after World War II, when both men reflected on the Holocaust and the atomic bomb, their different frameworks led to different interpretations. Jung saw these events as manifestations of the shadow, the dark aspect of the psyche that modern consciousness had tried to deny and repress. The more we identify with reason, progress, and enlightenment, Jung argued, the more powerful the shadow becomes, until it erupts in collective violence. The solution was not more rational consciousness, but integration of the shadow, acknowledgement of the darkness within each person and within the collective psyche. This required symbolic work, engagement with the unconscious, acceptance that civilization is always precarious because consciousness is always limited. Fromm saw the same events as manifestations of specific character structures produced by authoritarian societies and exploitative economic systems. The Holocaust was not an inevitable eruption of archetypal shadow, but the result of systematic dehumanization, enabled by propaganda, obedience to authority, and the reduction of people to functions within a bureaucratic machine. The atomic bomb represented the necrophilous character structure of technological civilization, which values mechanical efficiency over organic life. The solution was not primarily inner work, but social transformation, creating democratic institutions that promote life-affirming character structures, developing a humanistic ethics, based on the objective requirements of human nature. Which interpretation is correct? The question assumes they are mutually exclusive, but perhaps they address different aspects of a multidimensional problem. Jung's archetypal analysis captures something about the numinous quality of evil, the way it can possess consciousness and seem to have an autonomous power beyond rational explanation. Fromm's social analysis captures something about the concrete mechanisms through which evil is organized, normalized, and perpetuated. Jung helps us understand the fascination, the sense of being gripped by something larger than oneself. Fromm helps us understand the social and psychological conditions that make such gripping possible. As the night deepens around you, let these two voices continue their dialogue in your mind. Imagine Jung and Fromm sitting together in Jung's tower by the lake, the stones holding centuries of silence, while their conversation probes the mysteries of human nature. Jung might speak of a dream, tracing its symbols back to alchemical texts and ancient myths, showing how the dreamer's personal struggle recapitulates eternal patterns. Fromm might listen, then gently question whether this symbolic interpretation, however profound, helps the person address the concrete conditions that constrain their freedom to love and create. Does insight into archetypal patterns lead to change in actual relationships? Does symbolic integration address the alienation produced by exploitative social structures? And Jung might respond that without symbolic consciousness, without relationship to the deeper grounds of psyche, social change remains superficial, simply replacing one form of unconsciousness with another. The inner work cannot be bypassed. The self must be realized. The archetypes must be integrated, or else the shadow will sabotage every attempt at social reform. Fromm might counter that, waiting for individual integration while millions suffer under oppressive systems is itself an ethical failure. The prophetic voice demands action, demands confrontation with injustice, demands the creation of conditions that allow human flourishing. Neither man would convince the other, yet their dialogue would not be fruitless. In articulating their differences, they would each sharpen their vision, acknowledge the limits of their frameworks, perhaps glimpse how the other's perspective addresses questions they had not fully considered. This is the dialogue we inherit, the conversation that continues in contemporary psychology's tension between depth psychology and social psychology, between intrapsychic and systemic approaches, between symbolic and ethical frameworks. Let us now descend more deeply into the specific territories where their ideas converge and diverge, moving slowly through the landscape of concepts, theories, and visions, allowing each perspective to unfold in its particularity before we seek synthesis. The journey requires patience, for these are not simple contrasts, but complex intellectual traditions, each with its own internal logic, each revealing different aspects of what it means to be human. Consider first how each man understood the unconscious. For Jung, the unconscious was not merely personal, not simply a repository of repressed wishes and traumatic memories. It had a collective layer, shared by all humanity, structured by archetypes, universal patterns that shape human experience. The great mother, the wise old man, the hero, the shadow. These are not learned but inherited, not cultural but biological, not historical but eternal. They manifest in dreams, myths, visions, and psychotic episodes with such regularity across cultures and centuries that Jung concluded they must be intrinsic to the structure of the psyche itself. The archetypes are like the dry riverbeds that channel psychological energy into typical patterns. You cannot experience life without them, Jung argued, any more than you can see without eyes or think without brain structures. They are the forms of human possibility, the templates through which meaning emerges. Fromm rejected this notion entirely. For him, the unconscious consisted of all that has been excluded from conscious awareness, whether through repression, social conditioning, or the limitations of language. What Jung called archetypes were actually cultural, universals, patterns that appear across societies because all human societies face similar problems: birth, death, the relationship between genders, the need for meaning. These patterns are transmitted socially through stories and customs and child-rearing practices, not inherited biologically. To treat them as eternal is to mystify history, to make natural what is actually cultural and therefore changeable. When Jung found the same symbolic patterns across cultures, Fromm would say he was finding the effects of similar social structures and similar human needs, not evidence of a metaphysical collective unconscious. This disagreement was not merely academic, but had profound practical implications. If archetypes are eternal, then the task of therapy is to help individuals come into right relationship with these timeless patterns, to undergo the archetypal journey of individuation that has always been the path to wholeness. If, however, psychological patterns are culturally transmitted, then therapy must include analysis of how society has shaped character, and the goal might include changing social conditions, not just adjusting individuals to archetypal patterns. Jung's approach tends toward conservative acceptance of what is, finding meaning within the given structures of existence. Fromm's approach tends toward progressive transformation, refusing to accept suffering that results from unjust social arrangements, or consider how each man understood the self. Jung's concept of the self, which he capitalized to distinguish it from the ego, was his answer to the question of what centers and organizes the personality. The ego, our conscious sense of I, is relatively small and limited. It emerges from the self, that greater totality that includes both conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, personal and collective. The self is both the center and the circumference of personality, both the most intimate core of individual identity and the transpersonal ground that connects the individual to all being. It manifests in dreams and visions as mandalas, circles, quaternities, and other symbols of totality. The process of individuation is essentially the ego's establishing right relationship with the self, neither inflating itself to think it is the whole personality, nor dissolving itself into unconsciousness. The self has a teleological function. It guides development toward wholeness according to an archetypal pattern that unfolds over the course of life. Fromm had no such concept. For him, the self was not a metaphysical entity, but the totality of one's lived experience, character, and relationships. It was not something given, but something developed through activity and choice. You become a self by exercising your distinctively human capacities, love, reason, and productive work. The self is not realized by integrating archetypal contents, but by overcoming alienation, by bringing your actions into alignment with your values, by developing your capacities for relating to others with care and responsibility. Fromm spoke not of the self, but of the productive character, of self-realization in the sense of actualizing one's human potentials. This was not a journey toward a predetermined archetypal pattern, but an open-ended process of growth that would look different for each person because each person's gifts and circumstances are unique. Where Jung saw the self as a given structure to be realized, Fromm saw the self as an achievement to be created. Where Jung emphasized discovery of what already is in potential form, Fromm emphasized creative becoming, the freedom to make oneself through choice and commitment. Jung's language is mystical and participatory. One undergoes individuation, experiences the self, is grasped by archetypal forces. Fromm's language is ethical and humanistic. One develops character, makes choices, takes responsibility for becoming who one wants to be. These are not just different vocabularies, but different metaphysical assumptions about human nature and possibility. The divergence extends to how they understood psychological suffering. Jung saw neurosis as essentially meaningful, a sign that something in the unconscious is demanding attention. Symptoms are not just problems to be eliminated, but messages to be decoded. The depression that descends at midlife, the anxiety that accompanies a major transition, the strange compulsion that makes no rational sense, all these are often the self's way of forcing the ego to pay attention to neglected aspects of personality. Jung famously said that neurosis is the suffering of a soul that has not discovered its meaning. The cure is not adjustment but individuation, not symptom relief but transformation. The patient must learn to read symbolic language, to honor dreams and fantasies, to engage in active imagination, and thereby to integrate what has been split off from consciousness. Fromm saw neurosis as suffering produced by the contradiction between human needs and social conditions. Human beings need to love and create, to exercise freedom and reason, to relate to the world productively. But society often demands the opposite: submission, conformity, alienated labor, passive consumption. The result is widespread pathology that appears individual but is actually social. Depression, for instance, often reflects not a failure to integrate the shadow, but a realistic response to a life drained of meaning by exploitative work and commercialized relationships. Anxiety often reflects not the ego's confrontation with archetypal forces, but the existential burden of freedom in a world where traditional certainties have collapsed. The cure requires not just insight, but change, developing new capacities for love and creativity, and working towards social structures that support rather than undermine human flourishing. These different frameworks led to different therapeutic practices. Jungian analysis is an intensive, long-term process focused on the symbolic material that emerges from the unconscious. The analyst and analysan examine dreams, explore active imagination, consider myths and fairy tales that resonate with the patient's situation, trace the operation of complexes and archetypes. The relationship itself becomes a container for transference and countertransference, where unconscious contents are activated and can be worked through. The goal is not symptom relief, but transformation, not adjustment, but individuation. Analysis often intensifies suffering before it relieves it, because making the unconscious conscious means confronting shadow material, experiencing the death of old identity structures, undergoing what Jung called the transcendent function that brings together opposites in a new synthesis. Fromm's therapeutic practice, which he called humanistic psychoanalysis, was less focused on symbolic interpretation and more focused on character analysis and the development of human capacities. The therapist helps the patient understand how their character structure was formed by social conditions and family dynamics, how they have learned to relate to self and others in ways that block rather than enable flourishing. The therapeutic relationship models productive love, care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge so the patient can internalize this way of relating. The goal is not integration of archetypes, but development of the productive orientation, the ability to love and create, to think critically and feel deeply, to exercise freedom responsibly. Therapy ideally leads not just to individual health, but to social engagement, working with others to create conditions for human flourishing. Imagine a specific person coming to each therapist with the same complaint. A man in his 40s, successful in his career, married with children, comes to therapy saying he feels empty, that nothing has meaning, that he's tempted to leave everything and start over, but doesn't know what he wants. He has vague dreams of travel, of adventure, of a different life, but mostly he feels numb and trapped. Jung would likely recognize this as a midlife crisis, a classic moment when the ego's first half of life orientation toward achievement and social adaptation no longer serves. The self is calling for attention. Jung would ask about dreams, and the man might report dreams of being in a dark forest, or finding a door he didn't know existed in his house, or encountering a strange woman who beckons him to follow. Jung would help him see these as communications from the unconscious, which is trying to lead him toward previously undeveloped aspects of his personality. The strange woman is his anima, the feminine aspect he has neglected in pursuit of masculine achievement. The dark forest is the unknown territory of his inner life. The door represents new possibilities for consciousness. The therapy would involve learning to honor these symbolic communications, perhaps keeping a dream journal, doing active imagination exercises, exploring what creative or relational capacities he has sacrificed for success. The goal would be not to escape his life, but to live it more consciously, to discover the meaning hidden in his discontent. Fromm would approach the same man quite differently. He would ask about the specific conditions of the man's life. What is his work like? Does it allow him to exercise creativity and judgment, or is it alienating, reducing him to a function? How does he relate to his wife and children? With genuine care and presence, or as roles to be performed? What are his values, and how do they align with his daily life? Fromm might help him see that his emptiness reflects not a call from the self, but the consequences of living inauthentically, pursuing success as society defines it, rather than developing his own capacities for love and creativity. The therapy would focus on helping him clarify his values, develop his capacity for genuine relationship, find or create work that expresses his creativity. The goal would be not symbolic integration, but actual life change, new ways of relating, new commitments, perhaps new work that allows productive engagement with the world. Which approach is more helpful? The question reveals the limits of our comparison. For some individuals at some moments, Jung's symbolic framework provides the key that unlocks transformation. Recognizing the archetypal dimension of one's suffering can be profoundly liberating, connecting personal pain to universal human experience and suggesting a meaningful path through darkness. For other individuals at other moments, Fromm's clear analysis of how social conditions shape character provides the insight needed to break destructive patterns and claim freedom. Understanding that one's suffering is not entirely personal but reflects unjust social structures can relieve paralyzing guilt and suggest concrete avenues for change. Perhaps the deepest divergence between Jung and Fromm concerns the status of freedom. Fromm made freedom the centerpiece of his psychology. Human beings are distinguished from animals by self-awareness, which breaks the bondage of instinct but also creates the burden of freedom. We must choose who to become, how to live, what to value. This freedom is terrifying because it means we cannot blame fate or nature or society for our lives. We are responsible. Many people flee from freedom, submitting to authoritarian leaders or conforming to social norms or losing themselves in consumption and entertainment. But the only path to human flourishing is through freedom, accepting responsibility for one's life, making choices that align with one's values, developing one's capacities despite the anxiety this creates. Freedom in this sense is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of authentic self-direction. Jung had a more complex and ambivalent relationship with the concept of freedom. On one hand, individuation requires freedom from collective expectations, freedom to follow one's own path, even when it diverges from social norms. Jung himself lived this, breaking from Freud, developing his own unconventional theories, building a life that honored his inner experience, even when it seemed strange to others. On the other hand, Jung did not believe the ego is ultimately free. We are subject to archetypal forces, gripped by complexes, directed by the self toward an end we did not choose. Individuation happens according to an archetypal pattern that the ego can cooperate with or resist, but cannot fundamentally alter. Freedom, for Jung, means alignment with the self, acceptance of one's fate, conscious participation in a process that would unfold whether or not the ego wills it. This is less the existential freedom Fromm championed than a kind of mystical surrender to the self's teleological unfolding. The question of freedom connects to each, man's understanding of evil. Fromm insisted that human beings are not inherently good or evil, but are shaped by social conditions and make choices. Evil arises when people flee from freedom, when they fail to develop their capacities for love and reason, when they relate to the world destructively rather than productively. Necrophilia, Fromm's term for the character structure that loves death and mechanical things over life and growth, develops in specific social conditions, authoritarian families, exploitative economic systems, militaristic cultures. But it is not inevitable. Create different social conditions, and you will form different character structures. This is the ground of Fromm's hope. Human nature is malleable enough that social reform can dramatically reduce evil and suffering. Jung was more pessimistic, or perhaps more realistic about evil. The shadow cannot be eliminated. It is structurally intrinsic to having consciousness at all. Whatever the ego identifies with, the actorant's opposite is repressed and becomes shadow. Moreover, some archetypal energies are fundamentally destructive. Kali, the terrible mother, the archetypal rage and hunger that can possess consciousness. Evil is not simply a social product, but a permanent possibility rooted in the structure of the psyche. The best we can do is become conscious of the shadow, integrate it as much as possible, and remain humble about our capacity for destruction. Jung's later explorations of the dark side of God, his suggestion that God himself needs human consciousness to become whole, reflect his sense that evil is woven into the very fabric of reality, not something that can be overcome through social progress. These contrasting views of evil have different emotional textures. Fromm's view tends toward moral urgency. We must act to change social conditions because evil is preventable. Jung's view tends toward tragic wisdom. We must accept the darkness in ourselves and reality, cultivating consciousness and humility rather than imagining we can perfect humanity. Fromm's sensibility is prophetic, calling people to repentance and transformation. Jung's is mystical, inviting people to accept the coincidence of opposites, the interweaving of light and shadow. Their different approaches to religion and spirituality further illuminate their divergence. Jung spent much of his career exploring religious symbols and experiences. He treated religion not as illusion, as Freud did, but as the psyche's natural expression of its relationship to the self. Gods and goddesses, angels and demons, heaven and hell, these are projections of archetypal realities onto the metaphysical screen. Religious experiences, when genuine, are encounters with the numinous, the overwhelming presence of the archetypal dimension. Jung was particularly interested in mystical and esoteric traditions, alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern religion, because these seemed to preserve symbolic consciousness that mainstream Western rationalism had lost. He famously said, "I don't believe, I know," referring to his direct experience of the reality of the psyche's archetypal dimension. Fromm also wrote extensively about religion, but from a completely different angle. He distinguished between authoritarian religion, which demands submission to external power, and humanistic religion, which promotes human flourishing. Biblical Judaism, in its prophetic form, Zen Buddhism, early Christianity, these were humanistic religions that called forth human potentials for love, creativity, and reason. But religion had been corrupted by authoritarian structures that used God as a projection of earthly domination. True religion, for Fromm, was essentially humanistic ethics in symbolic form. The question was not whether religious experiences are encounters with archetypes, but whether religious ideas promote or hinder human development. Fromm could appreciate religious symbolism, but only as culturally specific expressions of universal human values, not as manifestations of a metaphysical collective unconscious. Where Jung sacralized the psyche, treating the unconscious as a source of revelation and the self as effectively divine, Fromm humanized religion, treating it as one form of cultural expression among others, valuable insofar as it promotes human flourishing. Jung's approach tends toward the numinous, the mysterious, the acceptance that reality contains dimensions beyond rational comprehension. Fromm's approach tends toward demystification, translation of religious language into psychological and ethical terms, insistence on human responsibility rather than divine providence. Consider how each would respond to a spiritual crisis, a person who loses faith in God and feels their life has lost meaning. Jung might help this person see that what they've lost is not God in some metaphysical sense, but a particular image of God that no longer serves their psychological development. The task is not to restore the old belief, but to discover what new image of the self is trying to emerge. Perhaps their old image of God was too much the senex, the authoritarian father, and they need now to encounter the self in a different form, as Sophia, divine wisdom, or as the wounded healer, or as the paradoxical union of opposites. Jung might work with dreams and active imagination to allow a new God image to emerge from the unconscious. The goal is not rational belief, but symbolic relationship, finding new forms adequate to one's current level of consciousness. Fromm might help the same person see that their crisis reflects not the loss of God, but the loss of meaning that comes from living inauthentically. Perhaps they had been living according to others' expectations, finding meaning in external approval, and now realize this is not enough. The task is not to find a new God image, but to clarify their values, develop their capacity for love and creativity, and commit to a way of life that expresses these capacities. Meaning comes not from relationship to archetypal symbols, but from productive engagement with life, loving others genuinely, doing work that matters, thinking critically about the world. Religion might continue to play a role, but only if its symbols and practices actually promote human flourishing rather than demanding submission. The contrast reveals how Jung's psychology tends toward introversion, privileging inner experience and symbolic meaning, while Fromm's tends toward extroversion, privileging relationship and social engagement. This is not to say Jung neglected relationship. He wrote extensively about transference, about anima and animus as bridges to the other, but his focus was always on the intrapsychic meaning of relationship, what it reveals about one's own unconscious contents. Fromm's focus was on relationship itself, the actual quality of care and responsibility one brings to engagement with others, the ways one relates productively or destructively to the world. Their different approaches to myth illuminate this contrast beautifully. Jung saw myth as the collective unconscious becoming conscious, archetypal patterns taking narrative form. Myths are not primitive science or childish stories, but expressions of psychological truth. The hero's journey, for instance, is not just a story type, but the archetypal pattern of individuation itself. Every person who undertakes psychological development recapitulates this journey, leaving the familiar world, facing trials and ordeals, encountering helpers and enemies, dying to the old identity, and returning transformed with new consciousness. To understand a patient's process, Jung would often think in terms of which myth they were living. Are they in the midst of the dragon fight, confronting the shadow? Are they descending to the underworld like Persephone, entering a necessary depression? Myth provided a map for understanding the patterns that individual lives follow. Fromm saw myth as cultural product, stories that societies create to explain their world and reinforce their social structures. Myths are interesting not because they express eternal truths, but because they reveal how societies understand themselves and justify their arrangements. The Oedipal myth, for instance, is not about a universal complex, as Freud thought, but reflects the specific structure of patriarchal society with its tensions between fathers and sons, its treatment of women as property. Different societies create different myths because they have different structures and problems. Fromm could analyze myths for what they reveal about social psychology, but he would never treat them as maps for individual development in the way Jung did. The hero's journey is not an archetypal pattern each person must follow, but a story type that serves specific functions in traditional societies and may or may not be relevant to contemporary life. Imagine the two men discussing a particular myth, let's say the story of Parsifal and the Grail. For Jung, this story is rich with archetypal meaning. Parsifal is the naive youth who must mature through questioning, who fails at first because he doesn't ask the crucial question, and who finally succeeds through persistence and the development of compassion. The Grail itself is a symbol of the self, the totality that is both lost and found, absent and present. The wounded Fisher King represents the split condition of modern consciousness, the king who cannot be healed until the right question is asked. The entire story is an allegory of individuation, showing the archetypal pattern by which consciousness develops and heals the split between ego and self. For Fromm, the same story is interesting as a medieval artifact reflecting the anxieties and aspirations of feudal Christian society. The Grail legend expresses the longing for healing and wholeness in a world torn by violence and religious conflict. It reveals the medieval valorization of questing and suffering as paths to redemption. It reinforces class structures only a knight can achieve the grail, and reflects patriarchal assumptions women are either temptresses or pure vessels. To read it as a universal psychological pattern is to ignore its historical specificity and to naturalize medieval Christian values as if they were eternal truths. We can learn from the story, but what we learn is about medieval psychology and social structure, not about timeless archetypal patterns. Which reading is correct? Again, the question assumes mutual exclusivity. Jung's symbolic reading reveals psychological depths that Fromm's historical reading misses. Fromm's historical reading reveals social dimensions that Jung's psychological reading neglects. A complete understanding might require both seeing how the story expresses archetypal patterns through historically specific forms, how universal human questions take shape in particular cultural contexts. As you drift deeper into sleep, let the voices of these two thinkers weave through your mind like complementary melodies, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes creating dissonance, always probing the mystery of what it means to be human. Neither man had the complete truth. Each saw clearly certain aspects of psychological reality while remaining somewhat blind to others. Jung saw the depths, the symbolic dimension, the power of images and archetypes to structure experience, but he sometimes neglected the concrete social conditions that enable or prevent human flourishing. Fromm saw the social determinants, the ways character is shaped by economic and political structures, the importance of love and freedom for human development, but he sometimes neglected the transpersonal dimension, the power of symbol and myth to carry meanings that transcend individual or social psychology. Their dialogue, conducted across decades and continents, never directly, but always implicitly, reveals the creative tensions that animate psychology itself. Must we choose between depth and social engagement, between symbolic imagination and ethical reason, between integration of the unconscious and commitment to justice? Or might we hold both, developing a psychology that honors inner experience and social responsibility, that reads symbols without neglecting history, that seeks wholeness without ignoring the conditions that make wholeness possible or impossible? The second half of their lives unfolded in contrasting ways. Jung, after his near-death experience in 1944, entered his most productive period, writing his major works on alchemy, synchronicity, and the psychological interpretation of Christian doctrine. He had passed through his own dark night and emerged with a vision of the psyche as fundamentally whole, however much individual consciousness might be split. His late work has a quality of hard-won serenity, acceptance of paradox, appreciation for the mystery that cannot be rationally explained. He died in 1961, having established a school of thought that continues to attract those seeking depth, those for whom rational explanation feels insufficient, those who hunger for encounter with the numinous. Fromm's later years were marked by increasing political engagement and growing despair about the direction of industrial society. He analyzed the nuclear arms race, critiqued both Soviet communism and Western capitalism for producing alienated populations, and tried to articulate a vision of humanistic socialism that would promote freedom and love. His writing grew more urgent, less academic, appealing directly to readers to examine their lives and choose authentic existence over conformity and consumption. He spent his final years in Switzerland, not far from where Jung had lived, dying in 1980. Having established a humanistic psychology that continues to attract those seeking integration of psychological insight with social critique, those for whom depth psychology feels too removed from pressing ethical and political questions. Both men struggled in their late years with the question of whether their work had made a difference. Jung saw psychology fragmenting, with behavioral and biological approaches gaining dominance, and worried that symbolic consciousness was being lost. Fromm saw consumer capitalism spreading globally, producing ever more alienated and narcissistic populations, and wondered whether humanistic values could survive. Both continued writing, teaching, and practicing, hoping that seeds planted would eventually bear fruit, even if the harvest wasn't immediate. Let us explore now how they would encounter each other's central concepts in depth. We have circled these ideas. Now we must enter them, moving slowly through the territory where their visions meet and part, allowing the full complexity of each perspective to emerge before we seek synthesis or judgment. Consider first Fromm's concept of love, which he developed most fully in The Art of Loving. Fromm argued that love is fundamentally about giving rather than receiving, but giving in a special sense. When I love, I give to you for my aliveness, my interest, understanding, knowledge, joy, humor, and sadness. In giving, I enrich you, but I also enrich myself because giving expresses my own vitality. This kind of giving is possible only when I have overcome narcissism, the infantile demand that the world exists to satisfy my needs. Mature love requires 4 elements: care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. Care means actively promoting the other's growth and well-being. Responsibility means responding to the other's needs, not as a burden, but as a chosen commitment. Respect means seeing the other as they are, not as I need them to be. Knowledge means understanding the other deeply, which requires overcoming my narcissistic projections. This is a beautiful vision, but how would Jung respond to it? He might appreciate Fromm's emphasis on overcoming narcissism, which parallels his own insistence on withdrawing projections. But Jung would likely question whether Fromm adequately accounts for the unconscious dimension of love. In Jung's view, what Fromm calls narcissism includes not only personal immaturity but also archetypal inflation. When a man falls in love, he projects his anima, the feminine aspect of his own psyche, onto the woman, experiencing her as his soulmate, the one who completes him. This is not just personal need, but archetypal pattern. The psychological task is not simply to develop mature love, as Fromm describes it, but to recognize the anima as an inner figure, to withdraw the projection without destroying the relationship, and thereby to encounter both the actual woman and one's own inner feminine more consciously. From Jung's perspective, Fromm's approach might work well for someone whose consciousness is already fairly developed, but might miss the archetypal depths that activate an intimate relationship. Romantic love is not just mature care and responsibility. It's often an encounter with numinous, overwhelming forces that exceed rational control. The person in love is possessed by an archetype, gripped by energies that feel divine or demonic. Simply prescribing mature love as an art to be practiced might not adequately address these archetypal dimensions. Jung would want to know, what archetypal pattern is being constellated in this love? Is it mother-son, which might lead to suffocation? Is it syzygy, the union of opposites, which promises wholeness but requires conscious individuation? Is it the love that kills, the Liebestod, romantic merger that destroys individual identity? Fromm might respond that Jung's focus on archetypal patterns risks mystifying what are actually character issues rooted in social and family conditions. The man who cannot love maturely has not failed to integrate his anima. He has failed to overcome. The narcissism produced by a consumer society that treats people as objects to be used. The woman who seeks completion in romantic union has not been seized by a syzygy archetype. She has internalized patriarchal messages that a woman's identity depends on relationship to a man. To speak of archetypal patterns in these cases is to naturalize what should be questioned and changed. It removes agency from people. They're just living out archetypal patterns rather than calling them to take responsibility for developing their capacity to love. And Jung might counter that this rational, ethical approach, however valuable, misses the soul's need for symbolic meaning. Love is not just a skill to be developed, but a mystery to be lived, an encounter with forces larger than the ego. To reduce it to care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge is to lose precisely what makes love transformative, its numinous quality, its power to shatter ordinary consciousness and reveal transpersonal dimensions. Fromm's approach might produce decent, responsible relationships, Jung might suggest. But would it produce the kind of love that transforms, that leads to individuation, that serves the self's purpose? This imagined dialogue between Jung and Fromm reveals that they're actually talking about different things while using the same word. When Fromm speaks of love, he means a specific character orientation, a way of being in the world that promotes human flourishing. It can be learned, practiced, developed through conscious effort and insight into how one's character has been formed. When Jung speaks of love, he means something more mysterious, eros as a cosmic force, the coniunctio as the union of opposites, love as the vehicle through which archetypal integration happens. For Jung, love is not primarily about relationship with actual others, but about the relationship between different aspects of the psyche, which then manifests in outward relationships. Both perspectives seem necessary. Fromm's helps us take responsibility for how we treat others, developing the maturity necessary for sustainable relationship. Jung's helps us honor the depth and mystery of love, recognizing when archetypal forces are at work and need to be consciously related to rather than simply acted out. A complete psychology of love might weave these together, attending to both character development and archetypal pattern, both ethical responsibility and symbolic meaning. Consider next the contrasting ways they understood freedom. For Fromm, freedom is the central problem of human existence. We are self-aware, which means we know we are separate individuals facing an indifferent universe. This awareness breaks the bondage of instinct that governs animal life, leaving us free but also alone, insignificant and anxious. Fromm described this as the burden of freedom. Many people cannot bear it and seek escape through authoritarian submission, destructive behavior, or conformist robotization. The only path to genuine fulfillment is to accept freedom, to bear the anxiety it produces, and to create meaning through love and productive work. Freedom in this sense is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of authentic self-direction based on one's values and commitments. Jung's understanding of freedom was more paradoxical. The ego is not ultimately free because it emerges from the self and remains subject to archetypal forces. You cannot simply choose who to become. Your individuation follows an archetypal pattern that will unfold whether or not you consciously participate. In this sense, Jung's psychology has a fatalistic element where you have a destiny encoded in the structure of your psyche, and the question is whether you will live it consciously or unconsciously. Yet Jung also emphasized freedom in another sense, freedom from the collective, the courage to follow one's own path even when it diverges from social expectations. Individuation requires breaking with collective values, enduring isolation, and accepting responsibility for one's unique way of being. This is freedom not from fate, but within fate, conscious participation in the self's unfolding. How would Fromm respond to Jung's view? He might see it as a sophisticated form of escape from freedom, using archetypal determinism to avoid full acceptance of human responsibility. If I believe my life follows an archetypal pattern, I can avoid the anxiety of genuine choice. I can tell myself that my neurosis serves the self's purpose, that my suffering is meaningful, that I'm undergoing an archetypal process and thereby avoid confronting the concrete ways I'm choosing, through inaction or misguided action, to perpetuate my own suffering. Fromm would insist that we are radically free, that we create ourselves through our choices, and that invoking archetypes is often a way to avoid this terrifying freedom. Jung might respond that Fromm's emphasis on radical freedom is psychologically naive, ignoring the actual experience of being gripped by forces beyond ego control. Anyone who has been in the grip of a complex knows the feeling of helplessness, of watching oneself do things one doesn't want to do. Anyone who has experienced numinous dreams or synchronistic events knows the sense of being subject to something larger than ego consciousness. To insist on radical freedom in the face of these experiences is to defend an inflated ego position, pretending that consciousness is more powerful than it is. True freedom comes not from asserting ego autonomy, but from recognizing the ego's limits and establishing right relationship with the self. Again, their disagreement seems rooted in different levels of analysis. Fromm is primarily concerned with the ethical and existential dimension, how we take responsibility for our lives, how we overcome social conditioning that limits our freedom, how we choose authenticity over conformity. Jung is primarily concerned with the psychological and spiritual dimension, how consciousness relates to the unconscious, how archetypal patterns, structure, experience, how the ego participates in the self's teleological unfolding. Both levels seem real and important, suggesting that a complete psychology must hold the tension between existential freedom and archetypal pattern. Consider how they would approach a specific case, a woman who feels trapped in her life, unable to leave an unfulfilling marriage, unable to pursue work that interests her, unable to claim her own voice. She comes to therapy depressed and anxious, saying she feels like she's watching her life from outside, going through motions without vitality or meaning. Fromm would likely help her examine her character structure. How did she learn to subordinate her own needs to others' demands? What messages did she receive about women's roles? What economic realities constrain her options? He would help her see that her paralysis is not fate, but the result of specific social and psychological conditions. She has internalized patriarchal values that tell her a woman's worth comes from serving others. She has developed what Fromm called the receptive or hoarding orientation rather than the productive orientation. The therapeutic work would involve helping her clarify her values, develop her capacity for independence and self-assertion, and take concrete steps toward a more authentic life. Fromm would encourage her to see that she is free, that the constraints she experiences are not absolute, and that claiming her freedom is both possible and necessary. Jung would also want to help her, but his approach would be quite different. He would ask about her dreams. Perhaps she dreams of being trapped in a house, or of discovering rooms she didn't know existed, or of animals that are caged or wild. Jung would see these as communications from the unconscious, showing both her current condition and pointing toward potential. transformation. He might explore what archetypal pattern is being constellated. Is she trapped in identification with the Demeter archetype, living through her children, unable to claim her own life? Is she experiencing the call of the anima, the awakening of previously unconscious aspects of herself that demand expression? The therapeutic work would involve helping her honor these symbolic communications, perhaps doing active imagination to dialogue with dream figures, exploring myths and fairy tales that resonate with her situation. Jung would help her see her suffering not just as social oppression, but as the self's way of forcing transformation. Which approach would help this woman more? The answer depends on many factors: her personality, her actual circumstances, what kind of understanding resonates with her, what resources she has for change. Fromm's approach might empower her to take concrete action, to claim her freedom and reshape her life. But it might also miss the psychological depths, the ways her situation reflects, not just social conditioning, but her own unconscious choices, defenses, and unintegrated potentials. Jung's approach might help her find symbolic meaning in her suffering and access deeper resources for transformation. But it might also risk leaving her stuck in symbolic interpretation while concrete conditions remain unchanged. The most helpful approach might integrate both perspectives, honoring the social reality of women's oppression that Fromm emphasized, while also attending to the archetypal dimension that Jung explored, helping this woman both claim her freedom to change her circumstances and discover the deeper meaning and potential in her psychological struggle. Let us turn now to their contrasting visions of human nature and human potential. Fromm's vision was fundamentally optimistic, grounded in the belief that human beings have inherent capacities for love, creativity, and reason that will flourish given the right conditions. He distinguished between various character orientations: receptive, exploitative, hoarding, marketing, and productive. The first four are neurotic, formed by social conditions that prevent human flourishing. The productive orientation is healthy, characterized by the ability to love and create, to think critically and feel deeply, to relate to the world with vitality rather than alienation. Fromm believed that social reform could dramatically increase the proportion of people who develop productive character structures, create democratic institutions, humanistic education, meaningful work, and communities based on solidarity rather than exploitation, and human nature will flourish. This optimism was rooted in Fromm's reading of human history and anthropology. He argued that humans are not inherently aggressive or selfish, as Freud thought. Studies of hunter-gatherer societies showed that humans could live peacefully, cooperatively, and egalitarily. Destructive behavior emerges under specific social conditions: scarcity, hierarchy, authoritarian, child-rearing, alienating work. Change these conditions, and you change character. This was the basis of Fromm's political engagement. He believed social transformation was not just possible, but necessary and urgent. Jung's vision of human nature was more complex and tragic. He recognized great potential for development. Individuation can lead to remarkable wholeness and consciousness, but he did not believe that social conditions alone determine whether this potential is realized. The psyche has its own structure and dynamics, largely independent of social conditions. Archetypes will manifest whether society is just or unjust, democratic or authoritarian. The shadow cannot be eliminated through social reform because it's structurally intrinsic to consciousness itself. Whatever the ego identifies with, the opposite is repressed. Moreover, some psychological potentials are destructive. The archetype of the terrible mother exists. The murderous rage of the shadow exists. the will to power and domination exists. These are not simply products of unjust social conditions, but permanent possibilities rooted in the psyche's archetypal structure. This didn't make Jung politically conservative, exactly, but it did make him skeptical of progressive faith and social improvement. He had seen how the Enlightenment's faith in reason led to the horrors of the 20th century, how atheism and rationalism produced not freedom but new forms of totalitarianism, how the rejection of traditional religion left people vulnerable to possession by political ideologies. In Jung's view, the way forward was not primarily through social reform, but through individual psychological work, becoming conscious of the shadow, integrating the contents of the unconscious, establishing right relationship with the self. Social change, without psychological transformation, was superficial and ultimately futile. How would Fromm respond to this view? He would likely see it as a rationalization of privilege and a failure of ethical responsibility. To focus on individual inner work while millions suffer under oppressive systems is to abandon the prophetic call to justice. To treat evil as an inevitable aspect of the psyche is to naturalize what should be resisted and changed. Fromm would point out that Jung's view serves those who benefit from unjust systems. It tells them to accept evil as inevitable, to focus on their inner work rather than social transformation, to see their privilege as fate rather than as the result of exploitation. Moreover, Fromm would argue, Jung's emphasis on archetypal patterns risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we tell people that the shadow is inevitable, that aggression is archetypal, that evil cannot be eliminated, we encourage resignation rather than transformation. If instead we show people that destructive behavior emerges from specific social conditions, we empower them to change those conditions. Fromm believed deeply in human plasticity. We are shaped far more by experience than Jung acknowledged. Change the experiences through social reform and humanistic education, and you change character. Jung might respond that this faith in social reform reflects Fromm's own shadow, the denied recognition that evil is more intractable than progressive optimism wants to admit. Every utopian movement that tried to create the perfect society has produced totalitarianism and violence, Jung might point out. Why? Because the reformers projected their shadows onto enemies, failed to recognize their own capacity for evil, and thereby became possessed by the very destructiveness they sought to eliminate. The problem is not just social structures, but human nature itself, the tendency toward projection, inflation, possession by archetypal forces. Unless individuals do the psychological work of integrating the shadow and developing consciousness, social reform will simply create new forms of unconsciousness and oppression. Their disagreement here is profound because it rests on different metaphysical assumptions about human nature. Fromm believed human nature is fundamentally open, shaped by social conditions, capable of flourishing given the right environment. Jung believed human nature has an archetypal structure that sets limits on what social reform can achieve. Both men can point to evidence for their views. Fromm can point to anthropological studies showing the plasticity of human behavior across different cultures. Jung can point to the recurring patterns in myth, dream, and psychosis that suggest archetypal universals. The question of who is right may not be resolvable, but asking the question reveals the deep tensions within psychology and political philosophy about the nature and potential of human beings. Consider their contrasting approaches to myth and symbol. For Jung, myth was the collective unconscious becoming conscious, archetypal patterns taking narrative form. Every culture creates myths, because every culture consists of individuals with psyches structured by the same archetypes. The hero's journey, the divine child, the great mother, the wise old man, the trickster, these figures appear across cultures, not because of cultural diffusion, but because they express archetypal potentials inherent in human psychology. To interpret a myth psychologically is to see through its cultural particulars to the archetypal universals it expresses. The details vary. Greek myths differ from Norse myths, differ from Hindu myths, but the underlying patterns are the same because human nature is universal. Moreover, Jung believed that myths remain psychologically necessary, even in modern secular society. Without living myths that connect individuals to transpersonal meaning, people become spiritually impoverished. The loss of traditional religious myths has not freed humanity from the need for symbolic meaning. It has left people vulnerable to possession by inferior substitutes, political ideologies, cult movements, consumerism. Jung's late work on the psychological meaning of Christianity tried to show how traditional religious symbols expressed psychological truths about the self, the union of opposites, and the goal of individuation. He hoped that people could reconnect with these symbols at a new level, understanding them psychologically rather than literally. Fromm saw myth entirely differently. Myths are cultural products, stories that societies create to explain their world and reinforce their social structures. They are interesting not because they express eternal truths, but because they reveal the psychological and social dynamics of particular cultures. To interpret a myth, one must understand its historical context, the social structure that produced it, the function it served in maintaining or challenging that structure. The Oedipus myth, for instance, is not about a universal complex, but reflects specific features of patriarchal Greek society: the anxiety about legitimacy, the competition between fathers and sons, the treatment of women as objects to be possessed. Different social structures produce different myths because myths serve social functions. For Fromm, the persistence of certain mythic patterns across cultures reflects not universal archetypes but universal human problems. All societies must deal with birth and death, with generational succession, with the relationship between individual and community. Similar problems generate similar stories, transmitted and modified through cultural contact and parallel evolution. But this doesn't mean the patterns are archetypal in Jung's sense, eternal forms existing in a metaphysical collective unconscious. They are cultural solutions to common problems, solutions that can be and should be interrogated for the social assumptions they carry. Moreover, Fromm believed that modern society needs to move beyond mythic consciousness toward rational consciousness. Myths served a function in traditional societies where scientific understanding was limited and social roles were fixed. But in a democratic, scientific age, clinging to myth can be regressive, an escape from the hard work of using reason to understand the world and create just institutions. Fromm advocated what he called humanistic religion, a form of spirituality that affirms human capacities rather than demanding submission to external authority, that uses religious symbols to express humanistic values rather than supernatural beliefs. How would Jung respond? He would likely say that Fromm's call for rational consciousness reflects Enlightenment hubris, the same faith in reason that led to the catastrophes of the 20th century. Reason without symbolic consciousness is dangerous because it inflates the ego, making consciousness think it is the whole of the psyche. This leads to repression of the unconscious, which then erupts in destructive forms. Myth is not something to move beyond, but something to reconnect with at a deeper level. The modern spiritual crisis is not that we have too much myth, but that we have lost the ability to engage myth symbolically. We need not more rationalism, but more symbolic consciousness. The ability to honor the mythic dimension of experience while remaining critically conscious. Fromm might counter that this symbolic consciousness Jung advocates is just a sophisticated form of irrationalism, a refusal to fully accept scientific understanding and human responsibility. To speak of archetypes and the collective unconscious is to reintroduce metaphysical entities that cannot be empirically verified, to re-enchant the world through psychological rather than religious language. It's ultimately a failure of nerve, an inability to accept that we are alone in an indifferent universe, that meaning is something we create rather than discover, that there is no cosmic order or purpose we must align with. And Jung might respond that Fromm's stance is precisely the inflation of rational consciousness he warned against. To think we can create meaning ex nihilo, that the psyche is simply a product of social conditions with no inherent structure or teleology, is to ignore the actual experience of depth psychology, the dreams that seem to come from beyond the personal, the synchronicities that suggest meaningful connection beyond causality, the numinous experiences that shatter rational frameworks. These experiences are real, Jung would insist, and psychology must take them seriously rather than reducing them to social conditioning or neurotic projection. Their debate about myth and symbol reveals the fundamental philosophical divide between them. Jung was essentially a Platonist who believed in eternal forms, though he located them in the collective unconscious rather than in a metaphysical realm. Fromm was essentially an Aristotelian who believed forms emerge from matter and history rather than preceding them. Jung's psychology tends toward mysticism, Fromm's toward humanism and rationalism. Both can claim validity, and the choice between them may ultimately rest on temperament and metaphysical commitments rather than empirical evidence. As we move deeper into the night, the dialogue between these two thinkers becomes dreamlike, less a debate seeking victory than a duet exploring complexity. Let yourself feel the pull of both perspectives, the way each illuminates aspects of experience the other neglects. Jung invites you into the symbolic depths, showing you that your personal struggles echo timeless patterns, that your dreams carry meanings beyond the biographical, that you are connected to all humanity through the collective unconscious. Fromm invites you into ethical clarity, showing you that your suffering often reflects unjust social conditions, that you have the freedom and responsibility to change your life, that love and creativity are skills you can develop through conscious effort and social transformation. Consider their differing approaches to the problem of anxiety. For Jung, anxiety often signals the ego's encounter with unconscious contents. When the unconscious is trying to bring something to consciousness, a repressed shadow aspect, an encounter with the self, the activation of an archetypal pattern, the ego experiences this as anxiety. The anxiety is not primarily about external threats or existential concerns, but about the ego's reluctance to expand consciousness, to die to its current limited identity. Jung saw anxiety as essentially meaningful, a signal that transformation is needed. The therapeutic response is not to eliminate anxiety through adjustment or medication, but to explore what the unconscious is trying to communicate through the anxiety. Often the path through anxiety involves amplification, exploring myths, fairy tales, and cultural parallels that help the individual understand their experience as part of a larger archetypal pattern. Fromm saw anxiety differently, as primarily existential and social. Human beings experience anxiety because we are aware of our radical freedom, our isolation, our mortality. Unlike animals guided by instinct, we must choose how to live, knowing that we will die and that our choices matter. This existential anxiety is intrinsic to being human, but it is intensified by social conditions. Alienating work, exploitative relationships, authoritarian social structures, and the lack of genuine community all increase anxiety. The therapeutic response involves helping the person develop courage to face existential anxiety without fleeing into destructive escapes, while also addressing the social conditions that amplify anxiety unnecessarily. The goal is not symbolic integration, but authentic existence, living according to one's values, developing genuine relationships, engaging in meaningful work. A person experiencing severe anxiety might hear quite different things from Jung and Fromm. Jung might ask about dreams, might explore whether the anxiety correlates with major life transitions, might help the person see the anxiety as the self calling for transformation. The work would involve honoring the anxiety as meaningful rather than pathologizing it, exploring its symbolic dimensions, perhaps discovering that the anxiety masks an encounter with death or the shadow or the divine. The anxiety might actually intensify during therapy as more unconscious material approaches consciousness, but this intensification would be seen as part of the healing process, the darkness before the dawn of new consciousness. Fromm might help the same person examine their character, structure, and life circumstances. Does the anxiety relate to living inauthentically, pursuing goals, society values, rather than what genuinely matters to you? Does it reflect isolation, lack of genuine relationship? Does it stem from work that alienates you from your creativity? The therapeutic work would involve clarifying values, developing the productive orientation, taking concrete steps toward a more authentic life, perhaps also examining social structures that need changing. The goal would be to reduce anxiety through increased authenticity and social connection, to help the person live courageously in the face of unavoidable existential anxiety. Both approaches have value, and perhaps anxiety has multiple levels: existential, social, and archetypal, that call for integrated understanding. The person who cannot find meaning might need Jung's symbolic framework to reconnect with transpersonal depths. The person trapped in oppressive social conditions might need Fromm's analysis to recognize their freedom and take action. The person fleeing existential freedom might need Fromm's courage to face anxiety without escape. The person whose ego is too narrow might need Jung's invitation to die to old identity and embrace transformation. Let us explore their contrasting visions of the goal of human development. For Jung, the goal was individuation, becoming who you truly are by integrating the contents of the unconscious and establishing right relationship with the self. This is a lifelong process with several typical stages. In youth, the task is to develop a strong ego, to achieve in the world, to establish identity and competence. At midlife, often through crisis, the unconscious demands attention. Neglected aspects of personality, the shadow, the anima or animus, begin to assert themselves. The ego must learn to dialogue with these figures, to integrate their perspectives without being overwhelmed. Later in life, if individuation proceeds, the ego establishes relationship with the self, experiencing itself as a limited center within a larger totality. The person becomes more whole, more accepting of paradox, more conscious of the archetypal dimension of experience. Individuation is not social, adjustment, Jung emphasized. In fact, it often requires breaking with collective values, enduring isolation, following a path that others may not understand. The individuated person has integrated enough of the shadow to be realistic about human nature, has withdrawn enough projections to relate more consciously to others, has established enough relationship with the self to have a sense of meaning that doesn't depend on external validation. Such a person is rare, Jung believed. Most people remain identified with collective values, living unconsciously, projecting their shadows, possessed by complexes. The individuated few serve an important function. They carry consciousness for the collective, preventing society from descending entirely into unconscious possession by archetypal forces. Fromm's vision of human development was quite different. The goal was not individuation, but the productive orientation, a character structure capable of love, creativity, and reason. Development involves several tasks. First, overcoming narcissism, moving from infantile demandingness to mature concern for others. Second, overcoming destructive symbiosis, establishing genuine independence while maintaining connection. Third, developing reason, the ability to think critically rather than accepting authority. Fourth, developing love, the capacity for care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge of others. Fifth, engaging in productive work activity that expresses one's powers rather than alienating one from them. Unlike Jung, Fromm did not see development as necessarily solitary or as requiring break with collective. In fact, genuine development requires community, relationship, social engagement. The productive person is not the isolated sage, but the person who loves deeply, works meaningfully, thinks critically, and contributes to the community. Fromm was suspicious of the kind of isolated inner work Jung advocated, sitting in meditation or doing active imagination. While the world burns seemed to Fromm an evasion of responsibility. True development means engaging with others to create a more just and loving society. For Jung, the individuated person has traveled deep into their own psyche, encountered its archetypal depths, and returned with increased consciousness. For Fromm, the developed person has overcome alienation, developed their human capacities, and committed to productive engagement with the world. Jung's hero is the mystic or sage. Fromm's is the prophet or humanist. Jung valued wisdom. Fromm valued justice. Jung emphasized consciousness. Fromm emphasized love. Yet both men agreed that most people fail to develop fully. Jung saw most people as unconscious, living collective values without individual realization, possessed by complexes and projections. Fromm saw most people as alienated, living inauthentically, having failed to develop their capacity for love and creativity. Both saw modern society as particularly problematic for Jung because it had lost symbolic consciousness and become possessed by rationalism, for Fromm because it was organized around exploitation and consumption rather than human flourishing. And both men believed that therapy or analysis could facilitate development, though through different means. Jungian analysis works with dreams, explores symbolic amplification, uses active imagination, attends to transference as an archetypal phenomenon. The analyst is not a blank screen, but a real person engaged in a mutual process of individuation. The relationship itself becomes an alchemical vessel in which transformation occurs. The process is long, often years, and is not about symptom relief, but about fundamental personality transformation. Fromm's humanistic psychoanalysis works with character analysis, explores how current difficulties relate to learned patterns, helps patients develop their capacity for love and productivity. The analyst serves as a model of productive love, showing care, responsibility, respect, and the effort to know the patient deeply. The relationship is important, but primarily as a vehicle for helping the patient develop capacities they can then exercise in their life outside therapy. The process aims at concrete life changes, better relationships, more meaningful work, clearer values, not just symbolic integration. Imagine these two approaches applied to a man struggling with depression in his 50s. He has achieved career success but feels it is meaningless. His marriage is distant. He has no close friends. He contemplates suicide, not actively, but as a fantasy of escape. Jung would likely see this as a classic midlife crisis calling for transformation. The first half of life has been about achievement and social adaptation. Now the self is demanding attention. Jung would ask about dreams. Perhaps the man dreams of being trapped in his office building, or of a woman calling him to follow her into unknown territory, or of his childhood home. Jung would help him see these as communications from the unconscious. The woman is his anima, the feminine aspect he has neglected in his pursuit of masculine success. The unknown territory is the unexplored regions of his psyche. His childhood home represents the need to reconnect with earlier potentials he abandoned for career success. The therapeutic work would involve honoring these symbolic communications, perhaps doing active imagination where he dialogues with the anima figure, exploring myths that resonate, perhaps the story of Dante at midlife entering the dark wood, or Orpheus descending to the underworld. Jung would help him see that his depression is not just a problem, but a necessary descent, a death of the old identity that must precede rebirth. The goal would not be to eliminate depression, but to find its meaning, to allow it to transform him. He might eventually discover creative capacities he had suppressed, relational depths he had avoided, spiritual questions he had dismissed as impractical. Fromm would approach the same man quite differently. He would help him see that his depression reflects living inauthentically, pursuing success as society defines it rather than developing his own capacities for love and creativity. His marriage is distant because he has related to his wife as a function rather than as a person, has failed to develop genuine intimacy. He has no friends because he has been too narcissistic, too focused on achievement, to invest in real relationships. His work feels meaningless because it has become alienated labor, divorced from his creativity and values. The therapeutic work would involve helping him clarify what he actually values, developing his capacity for genuine love by learning to be present to his wife, perhaps joining groups or activities where friendship might develop, considering whether he can reshape his work to make it more meaningful or whether he needs to change careers despite the sacrifice. Fromm might also help him recognize broader social patterns, the way consumer capitalism shapes people to identify with achievement and consumption rather than being and relating. The goal would be concrete life change leading to more authentic existence. Which approach would help this man more? Again, the answer depends on his particular psychology and circumstances. He might need Jung's symbolic framework to reconnect with neglected depths and find meaning in his suffering. He might need Fromm's ethical clarity to recognize his freedom and claim responsibility for changing his life. Ideally, he might benefit from both exploring the archetypal dimension of his midlife crisis while also making concrete changes in how he relates and works. As you drift further towards sleep, let the tension between these perspectives soften, becoming less a debate than a complementary exploration of different dimensions of human experience. Neither Jung nor Fromm had the complete truth. Each saw deeply into certain aspects of human existence while remaining partially blind to others. Their dialogue, the imagined conversation between symbolic and social approaches, between depth psychology and humanistic psychology, between archetypal and ethical frameworks, reveals the complexity of human nature, which cannot be reduced to any single perspective. Perhaps consciousness itself has multiple levels that require different approaches. The archetypal level Jung explored does seem real. Dreams do carry patterns that recur across cultures. People do have numinous experiences that feel transpersonal. Symbolic meanings do emerge that transcend personal biography. The social level Fromm explored is equally real. Character is shaped by social conditions. Oppressive structures do cause suffering. Love and freedom do require social support. Rather than choosing between Jung and Fromm, we might hold both, developing a psychology that honors depth without ignoring justice, that reads symbols without neglecting history, that seeks wholeness while working for social change. Their differences reflect, in part, their different historical contexts. Jung came of age when the great enemy seemed to be materialism and rationalism, the loss of symbolic consciousness that left people spiritually impoverished. His response was to recover the symbolic, to honor the unconscious, to take seriously the transpersonal dimension. Fromm came of age when the great enemy seemed to be authoritarianism and alienation, the social structures that prevented human flourishing. His response was to promote freedom, love, and critical reason, to work for social transformation. Both diagnoses contain truth, and the contemporary situation inherits both problems. We have Jung's spiritual impoverishment. Many people feel disconnected from meaning, hungry for something beyond material success, vulnerable to fundamentalism or New Age simplifications. We also have Fromm's alienation, people trapped in meaningless work, unable to form genuine relationships, living inauthentically in consumer society. Perhaps we need both symbolic depth and social transformation, both inner work and outer engagement, both individuation and productive love. Their debate about the nature of the psyche, whether it has an autonomous archetypal structure or is fundamentally shaped by social conditions, may not be resolvable through argument. It rests on different metaphysical assumptions that empirical evidence cannot definitively settle. Jung's experiences, his encounter with the unconscious, his dreams and visions, his study of alchemy and myth, convinced him that the psyche has an objective archetypal structure independent of social conditions. Fromm's experiences, his study of authoritarian character, his analysis of Nazism and alienation, his clinical work convinced him that character is fundamentally shaped by social relations and can be dramatically changed through social transformation. Both men can point to evidence. Jung can point to the recurring patterns in dreams, myths, and psychosis that seem to transcend individual biography and cultural conditioning. He can point to synchronistic events that suggest meaningful connection beyond causal explanation. He can point to the numinous quality of certain experiences that seem to come from beyond the personal ego. Fromm can point to anthropological studies showing the plasticity of human behavior across cultures. He can point to how character changes when social conditions change. He can point to the concrete ways that authoritarian families produce authoritarian personalities, how alienating work produces alienated people. Perhaps both kinds of factors are real archetypal structures that shape possibility and social conditions that shape actuality. Human beings might have archetypal potentials that manifest differently depending on social conditions. The archetype of the Great Mother exists as a possibility in the psyche, but whether it manifests as the nurturing mother or the devouring mother depends partly on actual relationships and social structures. The capacity for love is an archetypal potential, but whether it develops into productive love, as Fromm described, depends on social conditions that either promote or inhibit that development. Such a synthesis would honor Jung's insights into symbolic depth while accepting Fromm's emphasis on social determination. It would acknowledge archetypal patterns while insisting they are not fate, recognizing that social transformation can reshape how archetypes manifest. It would validate both inner work and social engagement, both symbolic consciousness and ethical commitment, both individuation and productive love. But Jung and Fromm themselves would probably resist this easy synthesis. Jung might insist that the archetypal level is more autonomous, more determinative than such a synthesis allows. Fromm might insist that, speaking of archetypes, mystifies what should remain clearly understood as social and historical. Their disagreement was not superficial, but reflected fundamentally different visions of human nature and possibility. Let us turn finally to how they understood the relationship between individual and collective. For Jung, the relationship was paradoxical. On the one hand, individuation requires separation from the collective, developing consciousness beyond collective values, enduring the isolation that comes from following one's unique path. The individuated person stands apart from mass psychology, has integrated enough of the shadow to resist collective projection, has established enough relationship with the self to not need external validation. On the other hand, the individuated person serves the collective by carrying consciousness, by making unconscious contents conscious, thereby preventing the collective from being entirely possessed by archetypal forces. Moreover, the collective unconscious is what connects all individuals. We are separate at the ego level, but united at the deeper level of archetypal psyche. Fromm saw the relationship between individual and collective quite differently. He distinguished between pseudo-individuality and genuine individuality. Pseudo-individuality is the kind of separation that actually reflects conformity. People think they are individuals because they consume differently, choose different brands, have different lifestyle preferences, but they are actually conforming to collective expectations about what it means to be an individual. Genuine individuality involves developing one's unique capacities, thinking critically rather than accepting social norms, committing to values one has chosen rather than absorbed unconsciously. But genuine individuality does not mean isolation. The fully developed person is deeply connected to others through productive love, is engaged in community, works with others for social transformation. The problem is not the collective per se, but unjust collective structures. The goal is not separation, but the creation of loving, democratic communities that support rather than suppress individuality. Here again we see their fundamental divergence. Jung emphasized the tension between individual and collective, the need for the individual to differentiate from collective psychology. Fromm emphasized the possibility of reconciling individual and collective through social transformation, creating communities that promote, rather than suppress, human development. Jung was more suspicious of collective existence, seeing it as inevitably inferior to individual consciousness. Fromm believed that genuine community based on love and solidarity rather than authority and exploitation was essential for human flourishing. Their different relationships to politics reflects this divergence. Jung was largely apolitical, believing that social change without individual transformation was superficial. He was skeptical of mass movements, which he saw as occasions for collective possession by archetypal forces. He was suspicious of democracy, wondering whether the masses had enough consciousness to govern wisely. His politics, insofar as he had any, were conservative, valuing tradition, hierarchy, and gradual organic change over revolutionary transformation. This conservatism was partly temperamental, partly theoretical, his belief that the psyche's archetypal structure set limits on what social engineering could achieve. Fromm was deeply political, believing that psychology must address social conditions or remain irrelevant to human suffering. He advocated democratic socialism, not as a rigid ideology, but as a social arrangement that would promote human freedom and love. He critiqued both Soviet communism and Western capitalism for producing alienated, narcissistic character structures. He participated in political movements, wrote for popular audiences about social problems, tried to influence public policy. His politics were progressive, believing in the possibility of social improvement through collective action, valuing equality and democracy, advocating radical change when structures prevented human flourishing. Which political stance follows from psychological insight? Jung would say that Fromm's political engagement reflected insufficient awareness of the shadow, projecting personal unconsciousness onto social structures, imagining that changing external conditions could solve problems rooted in human nature itself. Every revolution produces new forms of oppression, Jung would argue, because the revolutionaries carry their own unconsciousness into the new structures. Without individual transformation, social change is futile. Fromm would say that Jung's apolitical stance reflected privilege and ethical failure. Those who benefit from unjust systems can afford to focus on inner work while others suffer. The psyche Jung explored so deeply was itself shaped by social conditions. His own privileged position as a white, male, European professional colored everything he observed. To ignore social justice in the name of individual transformation was to abandon the prophetic tradition that calls us to choose life over death, justice over exploitation, love over indifference. Their disagreement here touches something profound, the relationship between psychology and ethics, between inner work and outer engagement, between personal and social transformation. Neither man was simply right or wrong. Jung saw clearly that social movements can become vehicles for shadow projection, that revolutionaries often recreate the very patterns they oppose, that without individual consciousness, social change is superficial. Fromm saw clearly that focusing on inner work while ignoring social justice is a privilege that not everyone can afford, that personal transformation divorced from social engagement can become self-indulgent, that unjust structures cause real suffering that cannot be addressed through symbolic integration alone. A complete psychology might need both insights. Jung's reminder that we carry our own darkness and must integrate it lest we project it onto others, and Fromm's insistence that social conditions shape character and we have responsibility to work for justice. The inner work Jung championed makes us more conscious, less prone to projection, better able to engage politically without simply reenacting unconscious patterns. The social engagement Fromm championed gives our inner work ethical grounding, prevents it from becoming solipsistic, connects personal transformation to collective flourishing. As the night deepens toward dawn, as your consciousness drifts toward sleep, let these two voices become a lullaby rather than a debate. Let Jung's voice speak to your depths, honoring the symbolic dimension of your experience. validating your dreams and intuitions, inviting you to recognize archetypal patterns in your personal struggles, suggesting that your suffering might carry meaning you haven't yet discovered. Let Fromm's voice speak to your ethical sense, calling you to examine how your character has been shaped by social conditions, inviting you to develop your capacity for genuine love, reminding you that you are free to change your life, suggesting that personal transformation connects to social responsibility. Neither voice can be reduced to the other. They represent different dimensions of human existence, both real, both important, sometimes harmonizing, sometimes conflicting. Jung gives us symbolic depth. Fromm gives us ethical clarity. Jung helps us accept paradox. Fromm helps us claim freedom. Jung invites us to die to old identity. Fromm invites us to choose new commitments. Jung shows us that we participate in something larger than ourselves. Fromm shows us that we are responsible for creating meaning and justice. Their dialogue continues in contemporary psychology, which still struggles with the tensions they embodied. Should therapy focus on intrapsychic dynamics or interpersonal relationships, on symbolic meaning or behavioral change, on accepting what is or working for what could be, on depth or social engagement? Different schools of therapy answer these questions differently, some leaning toward Jung's depth psychology, others toward Fromm's humanistic social psychology. The integration remains incomplete, the tensions unresolved. Perhaps this is as it should be. The human psyche is complex enough to require multiple perspectives, multiple levels of analysis, multiple therapeutic approaches. Some people, at some moments, need what Jung offers: symbolic frameworks that provide meaning, permission to honor the unconscious, invitation to undergo transformation even when it means increased suffering initially. Other people, at other moments, need what Fromm offers: ethical clarity that empowers. Action, analysis of how social conditions shape character, encouragement to claim freedom and responsibility. Most people need both at different times, or even simultaneously. The enduring value of exploring Jung and Fromm together lies not in resolving their differences, but in learning to hold the tension between them. Jung without Fromm risks becoming too introverted, too focused on inner symbolic work, while neglecting concrete relationships and social conditions. Fromm without Jung risks becoming too extroverted, too focused on social change, while neglecting the depths of symbolic consciousness and archetypal pattern. Together, they map different territories of the psyche, showing us that human consciousness is multidimensional, requiring both depth and breadth, both introspection and engagement, both symbolic awareness and ethical commitment. As you drift into sleep, imagine a final conversation between these two men, no longer debating but sharing what each has learned. Jung might acknowledge that his focus on archetypal universals sometimes neglected the concrete social conditions that enable or prevent human flourishing, that his political conservatism reflected privileges he did not fully examine, that symbolic consciousness alone is not enough if it becomes disconnected from ethical responsibility. Fromm might acknowledge that his focus on social conditions sometimes neglected the transpersonal depths of human experience, that his faith in social reform underestimated the intractability of shadow and the power of archetypal forces, that ethical consciousness alone is not enough if it lacks the symbolic dimension that provides existential meaning. In this imagined reconciliation, each man would gift the other what he himself lacked. Jung would give Fromm symbolic depth, the ability to read dreams and myths, appreciation for the numinous dimension of experience, acceptance of paradox and ambiguity, patience with the slow unfolding of transformation. Fromm would give Jung ethical clarity, commitment to social justice, appreciation for how social conditions shape character, insistence on human freedom and responsibility, urgency about relieving suffering through concrete action. The synthesis of Jung and Fromm would be a psychology that honors both depth and justice, both symbol and ethics, both individuation and love, both archetypal pattern and social determination, both inner transformation and outer engagement. Such a psychology would read dreams while also analyzing social structures, would explore myths while also examining character formation, would facilitate individuation while also promoting productive love, would honor the unconscious while also insisting on ethical responsibility. This synthesis is not just theoretical but practical. It would shape how we live. We would attend to our dreams, recognizing symbolic messages from the unconscious. We would also examine how our character has been shaped by social conditions, recognizing patterns we can choose to change. We would honor numinous experiences that connect us to something larger than ego. We would also develop our capacity for genuine love, relating to others with care, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. We would undergo the difficult work of integrating the shadow, accepting our capacity for darkness. We would also work with others to create more just social structures that promote human flourishing. We would follow our unique path of individuation, even when it means isolation. We would also engage in community, building relationships based on solidarity rather than exploitation. Such a life would be demanding, requiring both depth and breadth, both contemplation and action, both inner work and outer engagement. But it would be a life that honors the full complexity of human existence, refusing to reduce the psyche to either archetypal patterns or social conditions, refusing to separate personal transformation from social responsibility, refusing to choose between symbolic consciousness and ethical commitment. Jung and Fromm, each in his own way, devoted his life to understanding and relieving human suffering. Jung descended into the unconscious depths, emerging with maps of the archetypal territory, methods for integrating shadow and realizing self, appreciation for the symbolic dimension that gives life meaning. Fromm analyzed the social conditions that produce alienation and suffering, articulated the capacities needed for human flourishing, called for social transformation to create conditions that promote love and creativity. Both men wrote prolifically, taught widely, saw patients, struggled with their own demons, and left behind bodies of work that continue to challenge and inspire. Neither man's work can be simply adopted as complete truth. Jung's archetypal psychology sometimes verges on mysticism, treating symbols as if they have objective reality independent of human consciousness, neglecting social determinants of suffering. Fromm's humanistic psychology sometimes verges on rationalism, underestimating the power of unconscious forces, overstating human plasticity and the possibility of social reform. Both men had blind spots shaped by their historical contexts, their privileges, their temperamental limitations. Yet both men saw deeply into aspects of human existence that remain perennially relevant. Jung saw that we need meaning, that symbols carry truths that cannot be reduced to rational concepts, that the psyche has depths that exceed ego consciousness. That transformation requires descent and darkness before rebirth and light. Fromm saw that we need love, that freedom is both burden and possibility, that character is shaped by social conditions, that human flourishing requires both personal development and social justice. These insights remain valuable precisely because they address permanent features of human existence, our need for both meaning and love, our existence as both individuals and social beings, our capacity for both symbolic consciousness and ethical action. The conversation between Jung and Fromm, conducted across decades and continents, never directly but always implicitly, represents one of the great dialogues in psychology: depth versus breadth, intra-psychic versus interpersonal, archetypal versus social, mystical versus ethical, conservative versus progressive. This dialogue continues in contemporary psychology, in the tensions between different schools and approaches, in the lives of individuals struggling to integrate different aspects of existence. As sleep finally claims you, let go of the need to choose between Jung and Fromm, between symbol and ethics, between depth and justice. Let both voices fade into the background, having done their work of probing the mystery of what it means to be human. You carry within you both the archetypal depths Jung explored and the ethical capacities Fromm championed. You are both a symbolic being who dreams and a social being who loves. You need both meaning and justice, both transformation and relationship, both individuation and community. The dialogue between Jung and Fromm lives on in you, in the tension between your need for depth and your responsibility to others, between your inner work and your outer engagement, between accepting who you are and choosing who you will become. This tension is not a problem to be solved, but a dynamic to be lived, a creative dialogue that generates the energy for growth and transformation. Rest now in the knowledge that human consciousness is vast enough to hold both perspectives, rich enough to require multiple approaches, mysterious enough to resist reduction to any single framework. Jung and Fromm, each seeing part of the truth, together map more of the territory of human existence than either could alone. Their combined legacy is an invitation to live deeply and ethically, to attend to dreams and to relationships, to undergo transformation and to work for justice, to honor both the unconscious depths and the conscious commitments that make us human. Let their voices become a gentle current carrying you towards sleep, no longer debating but harmonizing, no longer competing but complementing, no longer divided but unified in their shared commitment to understanding and healing the human soul. As consciousness fades and dreams begin, you move into the territory they both explored, where symbolic meaning and ethical choice interweave, where personal transformation and social responsibility meet, where depth and breadth, darkness and light, solitude and community dance together in the eternal mystery of becoming human. Sleep well, wanderer. You have journeyed tonight through the dialogue between two great explorers of consciousness. Take with you Jung's appreciation for symbolic depth and Fromm's commitment to ethical action. Take with you the recognition that you need both meaning and love, transformation and justice, individuation and relationship. Take with you the permission to hold paradox, to live the tension between different truths, to refuse easy reductions of the soul's complexity. Tomorrow you wake to a world that needs both what Jung taught and what Fromm taught, symbolic consciousness, to provide meaning in a disenchanted age, ethical action to promote justice in an unequal world. Tomorrow you can attend to your dreams and also to your relationships, can explore your inner depths and also work with others for social transformation. Tomorrow you can live the synthesis that Jung and Fromm never explicitly created, but together made possible a psychology and a life that honors both the eternal and the historical, both the archetypal and the social, both the individual and the collective. But that is tomorrow. For now, rest in the spaciousness these two thinkers have opened, the territory they have mapped between them, the full landscape of human consciousness, from the archetypal depths to the ethical heights, from symbolic darkness to loving light. Rest in the knowledge that their dialogue continues in you, shaping how you understand yourself and others, how you make meaning and create justice, how you become who you are meant to be while remaining connected to all that is. Good night, seeker. May Jung's symbols visit your dreams, and may Fromm's love guide your waking. May you find both depth and breadth, both transformation and relationship, both wholeness and justice. May the dialogue between these two great minds continue to illuminate your journey toward becoming more fully human, more deeply conscious, more genuinely loving. The night is deep, the hour is late, and the conversation between Jung and Fromm has reached its natural close, not with resolution, but with recognition that human existence requires both their visions, both their gifts, both their partial truths, woven together into a larger understanding. Sleep. Now, and let that understanding become not just intellectual knowledge, but lived wisdom, not just theory, but practice, not just heritage from two dead thinkers, but living presence in your own soul's journey. Sleep and dream, and in the morning, rise to live both the depth and the breadth, the inner work and the outer engagement, the symbolic consciousness and the ethical commitment that together make a fully human life. Jung and Fromm, each in his own voice, bid you farewell and good rest, their dialogue echoing gently as you descend into the unconscious depths where all voices fade and only the mystery remains.